I found out my daughter changed her last name to her stepfather's. I didn't scream or cry. I simply stopped paying for her life. 2 weeks later, my phone lit up with a text. "Dad, my college fees are due. The portal says the payment failed." I replied with just one sentence. "Ask your stepfather, you made your choice." But I had no idea that 3 months later, they would drag me into a courtroom to cover up a secret they were desperate to hide. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The end of my family did not arrive with a shouting match or a slammed door. It arrived in a standard manila envelope on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The mail carrier required a signature for the certified letter. It had been routed to my home by a clerical error from the county courthouse, an administrative mistake that unraveled 15 years of lies. I sat at my kitchen table, a 66-year-old retired structural engineer, and broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was an approved court petition for a legal name change. I stared at the heavy black ink stamped by the judge. The applicant was my 20-year-old daughter. Her name was no longer Megan Gable. She was now officially and legally Megan Collins. She had taken her stepfather's name. There was no advance warning. There was no phone call trying to explain her decision, no letter attempting to soften the blow. Just a cold, sterile legal document that proved she had walked into a courthouse, sworn before a judge, and legally erased my existence from her identity. As a structural engineer, I spent 40 years of my life analyzing stress points, determining exactly how much weight a foundation could hold before the concrete cracked and the building collapsed. For 15 years, I had been the load-bearing wall of a family that treated me like dirt. I had absorbed every ounce of pressure, every financial burden, and every emotional slight to keep the structure standing for my daughter. But staring at that piece of paper, I realized the house was already empty. The foundation had crumbled. There was nothing left to support. I did not weep. I did not throw the paper across the room or reach for my phone in a fit of rage to demand an explanation. Rage is a useless emotion. It clouds judgment and wastes energy. Instead, a profound icy clarity washed over me. I stood up, walked into my home office, and opened my laptop. It was time for a controlled demolition. To understand the precision of what I was about to do, you have to understand the decades of quiet sacrifices I had made. When Patricia and I divorced 15 years ago, I walked away with almost nothing just to ensure peace. I agreed to a punishing alimony schedule. I paid for every single one of Megan's extracurricular activities, her expensive private schooling, her summer camps, her orthodontist bills. When Patricia married Stuart Collins 2 years later, I even ended up quietly funding Stuart's endless series of failed business ventures. Patricia would call me crying that Megan would suffer if their house went into foreclosure, leveraging my love for my daughter to extract business loans for Stuart that were never repaid. Stuart got to play the role of the fun dad. He was the guy who took Megan to amusement parks on the weekends, bought her ice cream, and let her break all the rules. I was the guy working 60-hour weeks, double-checking blueprints and poring over construction codes to make sure the checks cleared on time. Stuart got the smiles and the Father's Day cards. I got the tuition bills and the resentful sighs when I asked Megan about her grades. I was nothing more than an automated teller machine, a silent utility that existed solely to dispense cash and endure their disrespect. But utilities can be shut off. I logged into my primary banking portal. The screen loaded, displaying the complex web of automatic transfers I had maintained for years to keep Megan comfortable. She was entering her junior year at a prestigious, wildly expensive private university. I navigated to the Scheduled Payments tab. The first item was her monthly off-campus apartment, rent a luxury 2-bedroom place she shared with a roommate fully funded by me. I clicked Cancel. A prompt asked me if I was sure I wanted to permanently delete this recurring transfer. I clicked Confirm. Next was her premium car insurance policy for the vehicle I had purchased for her high school graduation. Cancel. Confirm. Then came her monthly living allowance, a generous stipend that allowed her to dine out and shop without ever having to take a part-time job. Cancel. Confirm. Finally, I pulled up the university's financial portal. The massive payment for her upcoming fall semester tuition and campus fees was scheduled to automatically draft from my account in exactly 12 days. It was an astronomical sum. I navigated to the payment methods screen, deleted my primary checking account routing number, and erased my credit card information from the system. I zeroed out every single financial connection tying me to her life. It took exactly 14 minutes to dismantle 15 years of unreciprocated financial support. When I closed my laptop, the silence in the house felt entirely different. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of an unappreciated father. It was the beautiful, weightless silence of freedom. I didn't wait around for the fallout. I had planned a quiet, solitary fishing trip to a remote cabin in upstate New York months ago, and there was no better time to take it. I packed my truck with my gear, a cooler of supplies, and left the city behind. The cabin had no Wi-Fi and virtually no cellular service. For 2 glorious weeks, I woke up with the sun, fished on a glass still lake, read old paperback novels, and drank black coffee on the porch. I didn't think about Patricia's manipulative phone calls or Stuart's arrogant smirk. I didn't think about the daughter who had legally discarded me. I just existed completely untethered from their endless demands. When the 2 weeks were up, I packed my truck and drove back toward civilization. The moment my tires hit the interstate, the cellular signal returned. My phone immediately began to violently vibrate against the dashboard. The notifications flooded the screen in a relentless wave. There were 42 missed calls. 20 of them were from Patricia, 15 from Megan, and 7 from Stuart. My voicemail inbox was completely full. I pulled over at a rest stop, put the truck in park, and opened my text messages. The progression of Megan's messages perfectly illustrated her descent into panic. The first few texts were casual, slightly annoyed. "Dad, the landlord called. My rent check bounced. Did you change your bank card?" A few days later, the tone shifted. "Dad, why aren't you answering? My insurance company sent a cancellation notice. Please call me back." Then came the messages from Patricia, dripping with her usual entitlement. "Lawrence, pick up the phone immediately. Megan is extremely distressed. You are acting incredibly immature. Call Stuart right now to fix this." I scrolled past all of them until I reached the final text from Megan sent just a few hours ago. It stripped away all the pretense and got straight to the point. "Dad, my college fees are due today. The portal says the payment failed, and they are going to drop my classes if it isn't paid by 5. Where are you?" I stared at the screen. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I was alive or in the hospital. She only cared that the money had stopped flowing. I placed my hands on the steering wheel, took a deep breath, and typed my response with deliberate surgical precision. "Ask your stepfather. You made your decision." I hit send. Before the delivery notification could even register on the screen, I opened her contact profile, scrolled to the bottom, and hit block. I did the exact same thing for Patricia and Stuart. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, merged back onto the highway, and drove home. The foundation was cleared. I was ready for whatever they tried to build next. The morning after I blocked their numbers was the most peaceful Saturday I had experienced in 15 years. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, poured it into my favorite ceramic mug, and sat by the large bay window in my living room. The neighborhood was quiet. The sun was just beginning to warm the hardwood floors. For the first time in a decade and a half, I was not spending my weekend reviewing bank statements or calculating how much overtime I needed to cover Patricia and her new husband's extravagant lifestyle choices. That perfect silence was shattered exactly 45 minutes later. The pounding on my solid oak front door was not a polite knock. It was a frantic, aggressive hammering that rattled the glass panes. The chime of my home security system echoed through the hallway. I did not rush. I took a slow sip of my coffee, set the mug down on the kitchen counter, and walked toward the foyer. I glanced at the security monitor mounted on the wall. Patricia and Stuart were standing on my front porch. Stuart was pacing back and forth, his face flushed a deep, angry red. Patricia stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, gripping her expensive leather purse like a weapon. She looked furious, but beneath the anger I could see the frantic energy of a woman who had just realized her endless source of funding had suddenly dried up. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. I did not invite them inside. I stood squarely in the doorway, blocking their path. Stuart immediately tried to step forward, using his physical size to intimidate me. He was a few inches taller and significantly heavier, a man who relied on bluster and loud volume to get his way. "Lawrence, what is wrong with you, Stuart?" bellowed, his voice loud enough for the entire street to hear. "You cannot just shut off your phone and hide like a coward." Megan is in tears. Her landlord is threatening eviction, and her university portal locked her out this morning. You need to log in and pay her tuition right now. Patricia pushed her way past Stuart, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "You are acting like a petulant child, Lawrence. How dare you ignore your own daughter when she needs you? You have financial obligations as a father. You signed an agreement years ago. You do not get to just throw a tantrum and ruin her future over nothing." I stood completely still. As a structural engineer, I spent my career studying how materials react under pressure. When you apply excessive force to a rigid frame, it screams, it buckles, it shifts the weight to the surrounding supports to keep from collapsing. Patricia and Stuart were buckling. They were crumbling under the sudden immense weight of their own financial reality, and they were desperately trying to shift the load back onto my shoulders. I let them yell. I let Stuart threaten to call his lawyers. I let Patricia list every single expense that was currently bouncing from my closed accounts. The rent, the car insurance, the sorority dues, the campus dining plan. I listened to them panic about the life of luxury they could no longer afford to subsidize for my daughter. When they finally ran out of breath, panting and glaring at me from my front welcome mat, the silence stretched out for a long, heavy moment. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice calm and perfectly level. Stuart scoffed, throwing his hands up in the air. "Do not play games with us, Lawrence. Just transfer the money. You know you have a financial obligation to your kid." I looked directly into Stuart's eyes. "That is where you are mistaken, Stuart. I do not have a financial obligation." "You do." Patricia blinked, her arrogant expression faltering for a split second. "What are you talking about?" "Stop speaking in riddles and fix this." I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, measured precision of a man reading a blueprint. 2 weeks ago, I received a piece of certified mail from the county courthouse. It was a copy of an approved petition for a legal name change, a petition that the three of you orchestrated entirely behind my back. The color instantly drained from Patricia's face. Stuart froze, his mouth hanging slightly open. They had no idea the court had mistakenly mailed me a copy of the final decree. They thought I was just acting out over a perceived slight. They thought they could keep it a secret until graduation. "You told me I have obligations as a father." I continued, keeping my eyes locked on Stuart. "But I am not her father anymore. Not in the eyes of the law, and certainly not in her own eyes." She walked into a courtroom, stood before a judge, and legally erased my name from her life. She chose to become Megan Collins. Patricia started to stammer, her hands shaking as she gripped her purse. "Lawrence, please, you are taking this entirely out of context. It was just a symbolic gesture. Stuart has been in her life for a long time. She just wanted him to feel included. It does not mean she does not love you. It is just a piece of paper. It is a legally binding document," Patricia Portai corrected her. "And in the real world, adult decisions come with adult consequences. If Stuart is her father in name, then Stuart is her father in responsibility." I shifted my gaze back to the man standing on my porch. Stuart was sweating now. The aggressive, intimidating posture had completely vanished. He looked like a man who had just been handed an anvil he could not carry. "You wanted the title Stuart. You wanted the prestige of being the fun dad without ever putting in the work. Well, congratulations. You won. She is a Collins now. Collins women pay their rent with Collins money. The tuition bill is roughly $40,000 for the semester. I suggest you call your bank. You cannot do this. Stewart panicked, his voice cracking. You know my contracting business has been slow this year. We do not have that kind of liquid cash lying around. You cannot just abandon her. I did not abandon anyone, I replied smoothly. I was dismissed. I am simply honoring my daughter's legal request to separate herself from me. I took a step back into my foyer and placed my hand on the edge of the heavy oak door. Patricia began to cry, actual desperate tears, begging me to wait, begging me to let her come inside and talk about it over coffee. There is nothing left to discuss, I said. Do not ever show up at my property uninvited again. I swung the heavy door shut right in the middle of Patricia's desperate pleading. The heavy brass deadbolt clicked into place with a loud, satisfying thud. I stood in the foyer for a moment, listening to them argue furiously with each other on my front porch, before their footsteps finally retreated down the driveway. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up my ceramic mug, and took another sip of my coffee. It was still perfectly warm. The heavy brass deadbolt clicking into place was not the end of the confrontation. It was merely the physical barrier that forced Patricia to drop her act. The doorbell immediately began to shriek in a relentless, piercing rhythm. Patricia was leaning her entire body weight against the button while simultaneously slamming her open palms against the frosted glass side panels of my front door. I stood in the foyer perfectly still, watching her distorted silhouette thrash against the glass. She had realized that fake tears and desperate pleading were completely useless. Now she was reverting to her most comfortable and natural state. Unfiltered, explosive rage. Her voice bled through the thick oak, muffled, but dripping with absolute venom. "You are a bitter, pathetic old man, Lawrence," she screamed, her vocal cords straining so hard I could hear the rasp in her throat. "You are doing this out of petty jealousy. You cannot handle the fact that Megan loves Stewart more than she loves you. You cannot stand that she wanted a real father and not just a bank account. You are punishing your own flesh and blood because your fragile ego got bruised over a simple name change." I did not answer. I simply watched the security monitor mounted on the wall. Stewart was hovering behind her, nervously looking up and down the quiet suburban street. He was terrified the neighbors would come out on their porches and witness the spectacle. But Patricia did not care about public decency or neighborhood gossip right now. When Patricia felt backed into a corner, she burned the entire room down to ensure everyone else suffered with her. "You think you can just walk away from us?" she shrieked, slamming her fist against the wood so hard the doorframe shuddered. "I will ruin you, Lawrence. I will call every single person we know. I will tell the entire country club. I will call the congregation at the church. I will tell everyone that you are a deadbeat who abandoned his own daughter right before her junior year of college because you are a jealous, spiteful coward. You will not have a single friend left in this city. They will look at you with absolute disgust." The threats continued to escalate, echoing across my front porch. She was digging deep into her arsenal, pulling out every psychological weapon she had successfully used against me for a decade and a half. The threat of social ruin. The threat of public humiliation. She was relying on the old Lawrence, the man who would pay any price to avoid a scandal. The man who kept writing massive checks just to maintain the quiet illusion of a peaceful family. She did not understand that the old Lawrence no longer existed. As I listened to her promise to destroy my social life, I realized exactly how little I cared. Those men and women at the country club were not my true friends. They were golfing acquaintances who judged a man's worth by the size of his portfolio and the brand of his watch. If Patricia wanted to spin a fabricated narrative about me to a crowd of shallow socialites, she was welcome to them. Let her have the gossip. I had my freedom. "I am going to make you pay for this," she promised, her voice dropping into a guttural, furious growl that carried clearly through the heavy door. "Do you hear me in there? I am going to drag you into court, and I am going to bleed you dry. I will make sure you spend your retirement entirely alone and completely bankrupt. You are going to regret the day you ever crossed me." She stood there for another full minute, panting heavily, waiting for me to open the door, waiting for me to engage in a screaming match. A structural engineer knows that the worst thing you can do during a seismic event is introduce unnecessary kinetic energy. You let the violent tremors pass. You rely on the integrity of the foundation. I remained completely silent. I did not utter a single word. Eventually, Stuart grabbed her by the arm, physically pulling her away from my porch. I watched the monitor as they marched down the driveway, got into Stuart's expensive, leased luxury SUV, and sped away, leaving black tire marks on the asphalt. The silence returned to my home, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Patricia was not making empty threats. When she promised to make someone pay, she treated it as a sacred, obsessive vow. She was going to come after me. She was going to try to dismantle my life, brick by brick. I could not control what lies she whispered to our mutual acquaintances, but I could absolutely control the physical perimeter of my existence. I walked into my home office and picked up the phone. I bypassed the standard consumer alarm companies and called a commercial security contractor I had worked with on several downtown high-rise projects. I explained exactly what I needed. Within 2 hours, a white commercial van pulled into my driveway. The technicians did not ask questions. They simply unloaded their equipment and got to work. I approached the fortification of my property the same way I approached designing a suspension bridge. Identify the vulnerabilities. Calculate the potential force of the impact. Reinforce the weak points. I spent the entire afternoon overseeing the upgrade. They installed high-definition night vision-capable cameras at every conceivable entry point. The front porch, the driveway, the back patio, and the side gates were now under constant, unbroken surveillance, recording directly to a secure off-site cloud server. We upgraded the basic motion sensors to advanced perimeter alarms that would trigger a silent alert to my phone the moment anyone crossed my property line. I did not stop there. I had the technicians replace the standard strike plates on all my exterior doors with heavy-duty steel reinforcements anchoring them deep into the wall studs with 4-inch steel screws. We installed shatterproof ballistic film on all the ground floor windows. It was completely invisible to the naked eye, but it ensured that a thrown rock, a baseball bat, or a desperate swing of a hammer would not compromise the glass. As the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across my front lawn, the lead technician handed me a master tablet. I tapped the screen and watched as a grid of crystal-clear camera feeds illuminated the display. Every single angle of my home was covered. There were absolutely no blind spots. If Patricia Stewart or anyone they hired decided to show up at my home again, their actions would be recorded in pristine high definition. I paid the contractor, locked the reinforced doors, and sat back down in my living room. The sun disappeared, and the exterior floodlights, automatically engaged, casting a bright protective glow over the yard. Patricia wanted a war. She wanted to ruin my reputation and drain my accounts. But she was about to learn a very difficult lesson about physics. You cannot break a man who has already dismantled the very things you are threatening to take away. I was ready for whatever came next. The reinforced doors of my home remained completely unchallenged for 5 days. Patricia and Stuart did not return to the property to test the new security system. Instead, the battle shifted to a digital front. On Thursday afternoon, I was reviewing an academic journal in my study when a notification chimed on my laptop screen. It was an email from Megan. I did not open it immediately. I let it sit in my inbox while I finished reading an article on load distribution and structural fatigue. When I finally clicked on her name, I knew exactly what the message would contain. The university payment grace period had expired 48 hours prior. The subject line of the email was completely blank. The message itself was a flawless demonstration of inherited entitlement. Megan did not bother with an apology or a formal greeting. She launched directly into a frantic and aggressive accusation. She wrote that she had just been locked out of the student registration portal while sitting in the campus library. The university registrar had temporarily unenrolled her from all her fall semester classes because her student account showed a severely delinquent balance. She complained bitterly that she had been forced to stand in a long line at the financial aid office. She wrote about how humiliated she felt when the clerk told her loudly that she had 0 pending scholarships and no authorized payment methods on file. She blamed me entirely for the public embarrassment. The second paragraph of her email perfectly mirrored the manipulative tactics of her mother. She wrote that she could not believe I was deliberately throwing away her entire college career over a simple piece of paper. She insisted that changing her last name was just a harmless gesture to make Stewart feel appreciated for driving her to the mall during high school. She accused me of being petty and emotionally abusive for cutting off her tuition without giving her a proper warning. She demanded that I wire the $40,000 to the university billing office by the end of the business day. She claimed that if I did not pay immediately, she would lose her spot in the advanced architecture seminar she desperately needed to graduate on time. She also added that her campus dining card had been deactivated and she had no way to buy groceries. Reading her words, I felt a profound sense of analytical detachment. She wanted to study architecture. I found the irony of that choice incredibly bitter. For years, I had tried to teach her the fundamental principles of structural integrity. I used to sit with her at the kitchen table helping her construct balsa wood models for her middle school science projects. I taught her that every single action has an equal and opposite reaction, and that every structural choice carries heavy consequences. But Stewart had always undermined those quiet lessons. He would buy her pre-assembled plastic models so she would not have to do the tedious work, and she loved him for making things easy. Now she was facing a massive real-world consequence, and she fully expected me to simply bail her out again. She called her legal name change a simple piece of paper. I looked at the framed university engineering degrees hanging on the wall of my office. My name was Lawrence Gable. My father had been a steel worker who destroyed his knees on an assembly line just so I could be the first person in our family to attend college. He gave me that name. I had spent 4 decades building a pristine professional reputation under that name. I had signed massive suspension bridges and commercial high-rise buildings into existence using that name. It was never just a simple piece of paper. It was my legacy and my heritage, and she had eagerly traded it away to flatter a man who could not even afford to keep her enrolled in her classes. I did not type a response. Any reply would only give her the emotional engagement she desperately craved. It would open a channel for negotiation, and there was absolutely nothing left to negotiate. The financial cord was permanently severed. If Stewart wanted the honor of having a college-aged daughter bearing his last name, he could figure out how to navigate the federal student loan process. I closed the email application and deleted the desktop notification. The secure silence in my house remained perfectly unbroken. I turned my attention back to my engineering journal and let the heavy reality of her decision settle firmly on her own shoulders. September faded into October, and October bled into a cold, crisp November. 90 days passed in absolute perfect silence. The perimeter alarms I had installed remained completely untriggered. The heavy steel-reinforced doors stayed securely locked. My inbox was completely empty of entitled demands, and my voicemail contained only messages from my dentist and my financial advisor. The total blackout was exactly what I had engineered. I adjusted to this new equilibrium with the ease of a man who had finally put down a crushing burden. I spent my autumn mornings drinking dark roast coffee and watching the frost gather on the back patio. I took my truck up to the mountains for 3 separate weekend fishing trips. I began drafting blueprints for a custom wooden gazebo I wanted to build in the spring. For the first time in a decade and a half, I was living entirely for myself. I did not wonder what Patricia and Stewart were doing to stay afloat. I did not wonder how Megan was navigating her academic suspension. A structural engineer does not mourn the collapsed building once the demolition order is signed. He simply clears the lot and enjoys the open space. The silence was the ultimate confirmation that I had made the correct decision. They only cared about my existence when my bank account was attached to it. Without the money, I was completely invisible to them. That deep, comforting peace held steady until the second Tuesday in December. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing a catalog for premium cedar lumber when the perimeter alert chimed softly on my tablet. It was not the aggressive, frantic hammering I had come to expect from Patricia. It was a single, firm knock on the front door. I checked the security feed. A man in a beige winter coat and a faded baseball cap was standing on my porch holding a thick clipboard. He looked bored and completely unthreatening. I walked to the foyer and opened the heavy door. The man did not try to push his way inside. He simply looked down at his clipboard and asked if I was Lawrence Gable. I confirmed my identity. He pulled a thick, dense stack of legal documents from a plastic sleeve and held them out to me. He stated that I was officially served and walked back down my driveway without another word. He got into a gray sedan and drove away. I stood in the doorway, feeling the cold December wind sweep into the foyer. I looked down at the stack of papers in my hand. The weight of the packet told me everything I needed to know. This was not a simple letter of demand. This was a declaration of total war. I closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and walked back to my study. I turned on the desk lamp and spread the documents across the smooth wooden surface. The cover page featured the official seal of the county civil court. The names of the plaintiffs were printed in bold black ink: Patricia Collins and Megan Collins. They were suing me together. I read through the dense legal jargon with the same methodical focus I applied to reading municipal building codes. They were not suing me for a few months of missed rent. They had filed a massive civil lawsuit demanding retroactive compensation and future damages. Their primary legal argument rested on a twisted interpretation of a concept called promissory estoppel. The lawsuit claimed that because I had consistently paid for Megan's luxury lifestyle and private education, for years she had reasonably relied on that promise to her detriment. They argued that my sudden withdrawal of financial support had caused severe emotional distress and derailed her entire academic future. But Patricia was cunning. She knew that promissory estoppel alone would not be enough to force a judge to drain my retirement accounts. She had dug deep into the past to find a structural weakness she could exploit. The second half of the lawsuit was built upon a highly obscure, heavily manipulated clause buried deep inside our original divorce decree. The clause loosely stated that both parents would make reasonable efforts to facilitate higher education expenses based on their respective incomes. For 15 years, Patricia had never contributed a single dime to Megan's schooling. But now she was twisting that vague legal phrasing to argue that I was in breach of a binding court order. I read the final page of the lawsuit. They were demanding $120,000 in immediate compensation. I sat back in my leather chair and took a slow, deep breath. They were not just angry that the money had stopped. They were desperate. People do not hire aggressive civil litigators to file massive lawsuits just to teach someone a lesson. They do it because they are drowning, and they need a massive influx of cash to survive. Patricia and Stuart were weaponizing the legal system to force me back into the role of their personal automated teller machine. The quiet equilibrium of my autumn was officially over. The battle was moving into a courtroom, and I was completely ready to tear their entire argument down to the bedrock. Vincent Rossi was not the type of attorney you hired to negotiate a polite and friendly settlement over a cup of coffee. He was the attorney you hired when you wanted to completely dismantle your opponent down to the foundation. I had retained him 12 years ago during a massive contract dispute over a commercial development project in the city. He had destroyed the opposing firm with terrifying precision. I walked into his downtown office on Wednesday morning and placed the heavy stack of legal documents directly in the center of his polished glass desk. I sat in the leather chair across from him and waited. Vincent did not offer a polite greeting or ask how my week was going. He picked up the thick packet and immediately began to read. The silence in the room stretched out for 10 long minutes. The only sound was the sharp flipping of heavy paper. Vincent was searching for the structural weakness in their argument. I watched his eyes scan the lines of text. I already knew the exact breakdown of their ridiculous demands. Patricia and Megan were not simply asking me to cover the fall semester tuition. They had weaponized the legal system to construct a massive extortion attempt. The total demand was $120,000. Vincent placed the documents flat on his desk and looked up at me. He explained their strategy with cold efficiency. $40,000 was allocated for the immediate university tuition and campus housing fees. $50,000 was classified as damages for severe emotional distress. They claimed my sudden financial abandonment had caused Megan debilitating anxiety. The lawsuit alleged that this profound stress required expensive therapy and specialized academic accommodations to keep her from failing her classes. The final $30,000 was categorized as retroactive living expenses. Patricia had the absolute audacity to claim she had been forced to liquidate her own personal assets to cover the sudden shortfall in the daily living costs of her daughter. I felt my jaw tighten. I told Vincent that Patricia had never spent a single dollar of her own money on that girl since the day our divorce was finalized 15 years ago. Vincent nodded slowly. He told me that in the realm of civil litigation, the truth does not matter until you can prove it entirely on paper. He analyzed their primary angle of attack. They were relying heavily on the concept of promissory estoppel. They were trying to convince a judge that my historical pattern of paying for absolutely everything constituted a binding, ongoing promise. They argued that because Megan relied on that implied promise, she was now suffering irreparable harm. Vincent leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. He told me that applying promissory estoppel to an adult child who had legally severed her name from her father was legally absurd. He stated that no competent judge would entertain the argument for more than 5 minutes. But Patricia was not relying on just one pillar to support her case. She had reinforced her attack with the vague clause hidden deep inside the original divorce decree. The clause stated both parents must make reasonable efforts to facilitate higher education based on their respective incomes. Vincent warned me that family court judges absolutely hate ambiguity. They hate presiding over prolonged trials concerning old divorce decrees. He said the opposing counsel was banking entirely on the fact that I had deep retirement accounts and a pristine professional reputation. They assumed I would take one look at the exorbitant legal fees required to fight this out in court and immediately offer a settlement just to make the headache disappear. They wanted me to offer $50,000 to close the case quietly. They wanted me to pay them to simply go away. I looked out the large windows of the office. The gray winter sky hung heavy over the city skyline. As a structural engineer, I never settled for a temporary patch on a compromised foundation. If you leave a crack in the concrete, the moisture will eventually seep in and destroy the entire building. Settling this frivolous lawsuit would only teach Patricia that she could continually use the court system as an automated teller machine whenever Stewart ran out of cash. I turned back to Vincent. I told him I would not pay them a single dime. I told him I was perfectly willing to spend $120,000 on his legal fees alone, just to ensure Patricia got absolutely nothing. Vincent smiled. It was a sharp and dangerous expression. He told me that was exactly what he was hoping I would say. He picked up the lawsuit again and tapped his finger against the signature line of the opposing counsel. He pointed out a vital detail I had completely missed. The lawyer Patricia hired was a notorious bottom feeder in the local legal community. He was a man who only took cases on contingency. He did not charge an hourly rate for his services. He only got paid a percentage of the final settlement if he actually won the case. Vincent leaned forward and rested his arms on the glass desk. He explained the profound significance of that single detail. Stuart Collins loved to project the image of immense wealth to everyone around him. He drove leased luxury vehicles and wore expensive custom suits to every social event. Vincent pointed out that if Stuart actually had liquid money, he would have hired a premium family law attorney on a massive retainer to crush me quickly. Instead, they had scraped the bottom of the barrel for a lawyer who required zero money up front. The pieces of the puzzle began to snap together in my mind. The frantic pounding on my front door, the desperate demands for cash, the sudden massive lawsuit filed right before the holidays. They were not suing me out of petty spite or lingering anger. They were suing me out of absolute sheer panic. Vincent stated that we were no longer just going to build a defensive wall. We were going to go on the offensive. He told me it was time to tear open their financial records through the discovery process. We needed to find out exactly why Stuart and Patricia were suddenly desperate enough to extort me for $120,000. The meeting ended not with a settlement plan, but with a declaration of total financial war. I returned to my home and immediately went down to the basement. I kept meticulous records. As a structural engineer, you do not throw away blueprints, and you certainly do not throw away financial documentation. I had heavy plastic storage bins stacked against the far wall. They contained 15 years of bank statements, cleared checks, and credit card receipts. I carried the bins up to my home office one by one. I placed them on the floor next to my desk. I opened a blank spreadsheet on my computer. I was going to quantify exactly what my existence had been worth to Patricia and her new husband. Vincent did not waste a single second. While I was pulling my personal records, he was launching a massive legal offensive against Patricia and Stuart. He filed a formal rejection of their ridiculous settlement offer. He did not counteroffer with a lower amount. He simply demanded a full trial. Then he unleashed the discovery process. Vincent drafted an exhaustive list of subpoenas demanding every single piece of financial data Stuart and Patricia possessed. He demanded 7 years of joint tax returns. He demanded the corporate filings and profit and loss statements for Stuart's contracting business. He requested all credit card statements, bank account histories, and records of any outstanding loans. Vincent knew that if you want to find a crack in a foundation, you flood the ground with water and see where it pools. The beauty of the civil discovery process is that it is legally binding. Patricia and Stuart could not simply ignore Vincent's demands. If they refused to turn over their financial records, the judge would hold them in contempt of court and automatically dismiss their lawsuit. If they complied, they would have to hand Vincent the exact blueprints of their financial ruin. They had walked into the trap completely blind. They thought filing a lawsuit would scare me into writing a quick check. Instead, they had just given a shark permission to audit their entire lives. While Vincent hunted for their secrets, I began the grueling process of auditing my own past. I opened the first plastic bin and pulled out a stack of paper bank statements from 15 years ago. It was the year my divorce with Patricia became finalized. I looked at the numbers printed in faded black ink. I typed the first alimony payment into my spreadsheet. Then I typed the first child support payment. I moved month by month and year by year. I did not rely on estimates or rough guesses. I entered the exact down to the cent figures of every single financial transfer. The process was emotionally exhausting. Each receipt I pulled from the box was a memory of a sacrifice I had made. I found the cleared check for Megan's middle school braces. It was $4,500. I remembered taking on a weekend consulting project just to cover that cost, so Patricia would not complain about the dental bills. I found the receipts for the elite summer gymnastics camps Patricia insisted Megan simply had to attend. I found the invoice for the safe, reliable sedan I purchased for Megan's 16th birthday. I typed every single dollar into the expanding rows of the spreadsheet. Then I found the records of the money I had sent directly to Stuart. I found the wire transfer receipts from 8 years ago when Patricia called me in tears. She had claimed that Stuart's new residential development project was stalled due to permitting issues and that they were going to lose their house if I did not help them. I had wired them $25,000 as a business loan. Stuart never paid back a single dime. 3 years later, there was another transfer for $15,000 to cover unexpected legal fees for Stuart's contracting business. Patricia had used Megan's well-being as leverage every single time. She would tell me that if Stuart went bankrupt, Megan would have to change schools and lose all her friends. I had paid the ransom over and over again to protect my daughter from the chaos of her mother's choices. I sat at my desk for 3 entire days. I drank pot after pot of black coffee. I did not turn on the television or listen to music. I just typed numbers. I watched the total sum at the bottom of the spreadsheet grow larger and larger. It bypassed $200,000 by the time Megan reached high school. It completely eclipsed $400,000 by the time I factored in the luxury apartment rent and the first 2 years of her private university tuition. I was looking at the undeniable mathematical proof of my entire adult life. I had funded absolutely everything. I had built the entire stage that allowed Stuart to play the role of the wonderful father. When I finally reached the bottom of the last storage bin, I hit the calculate button on the spreadsheet. The final number stared back at me from the glowing monitor. Excluding the court-mandated child support and alimony, I had voluntarily spent over $480,000 on Megan's upbringing and Stuart's failed business ventures. Nearly $500,000 of my own life energy freely given to a family that rewarded me by legally erasing my name and suing me for more. I did not feel sad when I looked at that final number. I felt a cold, absolute resolve crystallize in my chest. They had the sheer audacity to accuse me of financial abandonment. They had the nerve to claim I was ruining Megan's future over a petty grievance. I printed the entire 50-page spreadsheet. I gathered the massive stack of paper and placed it into a thick manila folder. I was not just going to defend myself in court. I was going to use this meticulous audit to completely dismantle their false narrative. The telephone on my desk began to ring. It was Vincent. I picked up the receiver and listened to his voice. He sounded incredibly satisfied. He told me that the opposing counsel had just attempted to file an emergency motion to severely limit the scope of our discovery requests. Stuart and Patricia were actively panicking. They were begging the judge to block Vincent from accessing the corporate bank accounts tied to Stuart's business. They claimed the business records were entirely irrelevant to a lawsuit regarding college tuition. Vincent told me that the judge had immediately denied their emergency motion. The judge ruled that because Patricia and Megan were claiming severe financial distress, they had officially opened the door to a full financial audit. The judge ordered them to surrender every single document Vincent had requested within 48 hours. Vincent said he expected a massive delivery of digital files by Friday morning. He promised me he would spend his entire weekend tearing through their ledgers. I thanked Vincent and hung up the phone. I looked out the window of my home office. The winter snow was beginning to fall, covering the suburban street in a pristine layer of white. Patricia and Stuart thought they could weaponize the legal system to intimidate a quiet, retired engineer. They completely forgot that my entire profession was based on finding the exact breaking point of a structure. They had built their lawsuit on a foundation of lies and entitlement. Vincent and I were bringing the heavy machinery to tear it all down. The audit of my own past was finished. Now it was time to uncover the ugly, desperate truth hiding in theirs. Vincent did not wait until Monday morning to call me. My phone rang at 9:30 on Friday night. I was standing in my kitchen wiping down the granite countertops. The moment I heard his voice, I knew he had found the fracture in their foundation. He did not bother with a polite greeting. He told me to immediately open my secure email portal and look at the digital files he had just sent over. I walked into my home office and woke up my computer. The files were massive, dense PDF documents containing hundreds of pages of financial ledgers, tax returns, and corporate bank statements. Vincent had completely gutted Stuart Collins' financial history over the last 48 hours. Vincent stayed on the line with me as I scrolled through the first document. He told me to look at the profit and loss statement for Stuart's contracting business for the previous fiscal year. I stared at the numbers glowing on the screen. The business was not just struggling, it was completely and utterly annihilated. Stuart was running a massive deficit. The corporate bank accounts were constantly overdrawn, and he had maxed out 6 different high-interest commercial credit lines. But a failing business was not enough to trigger a frivolous lawsuit against me. People go bankrupt every single day without attempting to extort their ex-husbands. There had to be something deeper, something far more dangerous pushing them over the edge. Vincent told me to open the second file. It was a formal public record from the county clerk's office. I clicked the link and zoomed in on the scanned document. It was a federal tax lien. The Internal Revenue Service had placed a massive lien directly on the primary residence owned by Patricia and Stewart. My heart hammered in my chest. The IRS does not place a lien on a luxury suburban home because you missed a single quarterly tax payment. They place a lien when you have been actively dodging federal taxes for years. I read the total amount owed at the bottom of the document. The figure was staggering. Stewart and Patricia owed the federal government slightly over $90,000 in back taxes, penalties, and compounding interest. The silence in my home office felt incredibly heavy. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying clarity. This entire lawsuit was never about Megan. It was never about her junior year tuition or her off-campus apartment rent. It was an elaborate, desperate smokescreen. Stewart and Patricia were backed into an inescapable corner. The IRS was preparing to seize their home and forcibly liquidate their assets. Stewart was likely facing federal charges for tax evasion related to his contracting business. They were drowning in debt, and they needed a massive immediate cash injection to stop the federal government from completely destroying their lives. They looked at me and saw the perfect mark. They knew I had deep retirement accounts and a pristine professional reputation. They assumed I would be terrified of a public scandal involving my daughter. They orchestrated the name change to isolate Megan, playing on her emotions and her desire for a complete family unit. Then they used her as a human shield, filing a lawsuit demanding $120,000 for emotional distress and college fees. If I had caved to their pressure and offered a $50,000 settlement just to make the headache disappear, that money would never have touched Megan's tuition portal. It would have gone straight to the IRS to keep Patricia and Stewart out of federal prison. They were using my daughter to extort the exact amount of money they needed to save themselves. I felt a cold, absolute fury rise in my chest. For 15 years, Patricia had manipulated my love for Megan to fund Stewart's endless string of failures. But this was entirely different. She was not just asking for a business loan. She had actively turned my daughter against me legally, erasing my name from her life, all to set up a massive financial scam. Vincent was silent on the other end of the line, waiting for my reaction. I did not yell or break anything. I spoke with the icy precision of an engineer who had just discovered the exact location of the explosive charges rigged to bring the building down. I told Vincent to prepare a countersuit immediately. I told him we were not just going to defend ourselves, we were going to obliterate them. Vincent agreed entirely. He told me that Patricia and Stewart had made a fatal miscalculation. By filing the lawsuit and claiming severe financial distress, they had legally opened their entire financial history to a full audit. They had essentially handed us the very weapon we needed to destroy them. Vincent promised me he would have the countersuit drafted and filed before the courts opened on Monday morning. We were going to expose the tax evasion, the bankruptcy, and the extortion attempt right in front of the judge. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my leather chair. The dark winter night pressed against the windows of my office. Patricia wanted to play a high-stakes game of extortion using my daughter as leverage. She was about to discover that when you try to demolish a solid structure with faulty explosives, the blast usually ends up taking you down with it. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for them to walk right into it. I was still processing the sheer magnitude of their tax evasion when Vincent placed one final document on the glass desk. He did not smile this time. His face was entirely devoid of amusement. He told me that when you forensically dismantle a person's financial life, you often find things you were not even looking for. He pushed a bank statement toward me. The logo belonged to a regional credit union I had not thought about in nearly 2 decades. My eyes scanned the top of the page. It was a custodial trust account. I had opened that exact account the week Megan was born. I had seeded it with an initial deposit and contributed to it every single month until the divorce. It was her actual college fund. Because Patricia was awarded primary custody, the court had designated her as the legal custodian of that specific account until Megan turned 21. I looked at the balance line. It read 0. I asked Vincent where the money went. He pulled out a sequential timeline of transfer receipts. The narrative they painted was the most devastating betrayal I had ever witnessed. 2 years ago, right around the time Megan graduated from high school, the trust account held exactly $85,000. It was more than enough to cover her first 2 years of university tuition. But the money never made it to the campus financial aid office. Vincent traced his pen across the dates. Over a period of 3 weeks, Patricia had authorized 4 massive wire transfers out of the custodial trust. She completely drained her own daughter's future. The money did not go to a savings account or a secure bond. Vincent tracked the routing numbers directly to the corporate operating account of Stewart's contracting firm. Stewart had stolen his stepdaughter's entire college fund to prop up his dying business, and Patricia had handed him the keys to the vault. The silence in the room was absolute. They had robbed her blind. They had stolen the very foundation I had built for her when she was just an infant. And 2 years later, when the university bills finally came due and their stolen cash was completely gone, they panicked. They orchestrated a legal name change to manipulate Megan, emotionally binding her to Stewart, while simultaneously filing a fraudulent lawsuit to force me to replenish the exact funds they had embezzled. They were using the legal system to make me pay for my daughter's college twice. I stood up from the leather chair. The cold, calculated anger in my chest hardened into something entirely unbreakable. Vincent asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told him to draft the countersuit. We were not just going to expose their bankruptcy and their tax evasion. We were going to trap them in a room with the daughter they had robbed and let her see exactly who she had chosen to name herself after. I did not call Patricia. I did not text Megan. I did not send Stewart a threatening email warning them of what was coming. A structural engineer understands that the element of surprise is the most critical component of a controlled demolition. If you tell a building owner you are bringing in the wrecking ball, they will scramble to reinforce the weak points. You do not give them time to brace for impact. You simply plant the charges and wait for the detonation sequence. Vincent and I spent the next 4 days constructing an absolutely impenetrable countersuit. We treated the legal document not as a defense strategy, but as a weapon of mass destruction. Vincent was a master architect of legal ruin. He drafted a formal response that systematically shredded every single claim in their original lawsuit. He dismantled the concept of promissory estoppel by citing explicit case law that proved a voluntary history of financial support does not establish a permanent legal obligation to an adult child. He neutralized their twisted interpretation of the divorce decree by producing the original unedited transcripts of our mediation sessions, proving Patricia had willingly forfeited all claims to future educational support in exchange for a larger share of my pension during the initial settlement. But the defense was just the outer shell of the document. The core of our filing was a massive, aggressive counterclaim for extreme civil fraud extortion and the egregious breach of fiduciary duty regarding Megan's custodial trust account. I spent the weekend meticulously organizing the physical evidence. I took the 50-page spreadsheet I had created detailing the $480,000 I had spent on Megan's upbringing and cross-referenced it with the physical bank statements. I printed high-resolution copies of the original trust documents I had signed 20 years ago when I established her college fund. I highlighted the specific clauses that name Patricia as the sole legal custodian and explicitly restricted the use of the funds strictly to higher educational expenses. Vincent handled the forensic evidence of Stewart's financial collapse. He compiled a damning dossier containing the public records of the federal tax liens. He included the profit and loss statements from Stewart's dying contracting business. He printed the wire transfer receipts that proved Patricia had drained $85,000 from her daughter's trust account and funneled the stolen money directly into Stewart's failing corporate operating accounts. We had the exact dates, the exact routing numbers, and the exact amounts. It was an unbroken, undeniable chain of evidence proving a massive financial theft. We placed all the documents into a series of thick, heavy binders. I looked at the stacks of paper sitting on Vincent's glass desk. We had compiled the definitive proof that the lawsuit filed against me was nothing more than a desperate, fraudulent scheme designed to extort me for the exact amount of money Patricia and Stewart needed to cover up their theft and save themselves from the IRS. They were attempting to use the legal system to force me to replenish the stolen trust fund before Megan ever realized her money was completely gone. Vincent reviewed the final draft of the countersuit. He did not ask for a single dollar in settlement money. He asked the judge to immediately dismiss their frivolous lawsuit with extreme prejudice. He asked the court to order Patricia and Stewart to fully reimburse my legal fees. And most importantly, he formally petitioned the court to refer Patricia to the district attorney's office for criminal embezzlement and the severe breach of her fiduciary duties regarding a custodial trust account. We were not just asking for our money back. We were asking the judge to send my ex-wife to prison. Vincent filed the massive document with the county civil court on Tuesday morning. He requested that it be served immediately via priority process server. I knew exactly what would happen when that heavy packet of paper landed on the desk of their contingency fee lawyer. The arrogant bottom-feeding attorney would open the file expecting a panicked settlement offer. Instead, he would find a flawless forensic audit, proving his clients were using him to facilitate a massive criminal fraud. I went home, brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, and waited for the shockwave to hit their fragile foundation. The deposition took place in a sterile conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown office building. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and the overpowering citrus cologne worn by the opposing counsel. His name was Mr. Walsh. He was exactly the type of attorney Stewart would hire on a contingency basis. He wore a suit that was slightly too tight across the shoulders and a silver watch that was far too large for his wrist. He carried himself with the aggressive, theatrical energy of a man who believed volume was an acceptable substitute for preparation. Vincent sat quietly to my right. He had his legal pad open, but his pen rested motionless on the table. Vincent had given me only one instruction before we walked into the room. He told me to answer every question with the absolute minimum number of words required. He told me to let Mr. Walsh fill the empty space with his own assumptions. The court reporter sat at the end of the long glass table adjusting her typing machine. Mr. Walsh turned on the digital audio recorder and officially began the deposition. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the glass, and stared at me with what he likely thought was an intimidating glare. He started with the basic facts. He asked me to confirm my name and my address. He asked me to confirm that I was the biological father of Megan Collins. He emphasized the last name heavily, trying to gauge my emotional reaction. I simply answered yes. Mr. Walsh began pacing slowly behind his chair. He asked me to confirm that on the 14th of August, I permanently disabled all financial transfers to my daughter's accounts. I answered yes. He asked if I provided any written or verbal warning before cutting off those funds. I answered no. He stopped pacing and leaned over the table, pointing a finger at me. He asked if I was aware that my sudden withdrawal of financial support would cause her rent payment to bounce. I looked at him with complete calm and answered yes. He asked if I knew her university classes would be dropped. I answered yes. He asked if I knew her car insurance would be canceled. I answered yes. Mr. Walsh smiled a tight, triumphant smile. He looked at the court reporter to ensure she was capturing every word. He thought he was currently building an airtight case proving my extreme negligence. He thought my single-word admissions were driving nails into my own coffin. He had absolutely no idea that he was just cementing his own clients into a trap. He began to press harder, trying to extract a reaction. He asked me why I decided to ruin my daughter's life on a random Tuesday in August. Vincent calmly stated an objection for the record regarding the argumentative nature of the question, but told me I could answer. I looked directly at Mr. Walsh and stated that I did not ruin her life. Mr. Walsh laughed a loud theatrical sound. He asked how I could possibly claim I did not ruin her life when I intentionally left her destitute right before her junior year of college. He asked if I thought it was appropriate for a wealthy retired engineer to let his own child starve. I did not blink. I told him that my legal obligation to support her had ended. He grabbed a copy of my bank statements that we had provided in discovery. He waved the papers in the air. He asked me to confirm that I possessed more than enough liquid capital in my checking accounts to cover her tuition twice over. I answered yes. He slammed the papers down on the table. He leaned in so close I could smell the strong mint on his breath. He asked if I simply decided to withhold the money out of petty jealousy, because my daughter legally changed her last name to honor a man who actually loved her. I sat perfectly still. I did not let a single muscle in my face twitch. A structural engineer knows that when pressure is applied to a reinforced surface, the best response is absolute rigidity. If you show flexibility, the opponent will push harder. If you remain a solid wall, they will eventually break their own hands trying to move you. I answered no. Mr. Walsh grew visibly frustrated by my icy demeanor. He began to pace again, his voice rising in volume. He asked if it was true that I despised Stuart. I answered no. He asked if it was true that I was angry about the name change. I answered no. He asked if it was true that I was trying to punish Patricia for finally finding happiness with a better man. I answered no. He threw his hands up in the air. He asked me to explain exactly why a man with a massive retirement portfolio would suddenly abandon his innocent daughter. He demanded that I justify my actions for the official court record. He thought he was backing me into a corner. He thought he was forcing me to sound like a bitter, vindictive old man who cared more about a piece of paper than his own flesh and blood. I kept my voice perfectly level. I told him that I stopped paying because Megan is an adult. I told him that she made a legal adult decision to change her family ties, and I respected her autonomy by allowing her new family to assume the financial responsibilities that come with that title. Mr. Walsh sneered. He asked if I seriously expected the court to believe that I was just respecting her autonomy. He asked if I expected the judge to ignore the massive emotional trauma I had inflicted upon a vulnerable college student. He stated for the record that my actions were nothing short of financial abuse designed to manipulate and control my ex-wife and her new husband. I did not answer. I simply looked at him. I let the silence stretch out for a long, uncomfortable minute. Mr. Walsh shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He hated the silence. He needed noise to feel in control. He started rapid-firing questions attempting to rattle my composure. He asked about the sorority dues. He asked about the campus dining plan. He asked about the grocery money. He asked if I felt any guilt knowing my daughter was crying in the financial aid office. To every single question, I answered no. I was giving him the exact narrative he wanted to construct. I was letting him establish on the permanent legal record that the entire reason Megan was suffering severe financial distress was because my money had stopped flowing. Mr. Walsh was spending his entire deposition proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Megan had absolutely zero alternative funds available for her education. He was so incredibly focused on painting me as a deadbeat dad that he completely failed to realize the massive structural flaw he was building into his own case. By aggressively proving that Megan was entirely dependent on my checking account, he was simultaneously proving that her custodial trust account no longer existed. If the trust account had been intact, Megan would not be facing eviction or academic suspension. Mr. Walsh was doing Vincent's job for him. He was putting Patricia in an inescapable bind for her upcoming deposition. Vincent sat quietly, taking a single note on his legal pad. He did not object to Mr. Walsh making wild accusations. He did not stop him from entering long, dramatic speeches into the official transcript. We were giving them a massive spool of rope, and Mr. Walsh was eagerly tying the noose around his own clients' necks. The deposition dragged on for 2 excruciating hours. Mr. Walsh tried every psychological trick in his limited arsenal. He tried insulting me. He tried shaming me. He tried appealing to my paternal instincts. He talked about how Patricia had been forced to work extra hours just to keep food on the table for my starving daughter. I knew, for an absolute fact, that Patricia had not held a steady job in 15 years, but I let him enter the lie into the record. Finally, Mr. Walsh ran out of breath and questions. He sat down heavily in his chair, looking exhausted and thoroughly frustrated by my lack of emotional engagement. He turned off the digital recorder and declared that the deposition was concluded. He glared at me across the glass table and told me that I was going to lose this case spectacularly. He told me that no judge in the state would look kindly on a wealthy man starving his own child out of spite. I stood up from my chair and buttoned my suit jacket. I did not offer him a polite farewell. I simply looked at him with cold, analytical precision. I told him that a structure built on a faulty foundation will always collapse regardless of how pretty the paint looks on the outside. Mr. Walsh scoffed and packed his briefcase. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his feet was already gone. I walked out of the conference room with Vincent knowing that the trap was perfectly set for Patricia to walk into tomorrow. The following morning, the atmosphere in the conference room was entirely different. Patricia arrived wearing a tailored designer suit and carrying a handbag that cost more than most people earn in a month. She sat across from us with her posture perfectly straight and her chin tilted slightly upward. Stuart sat in the corner looking incredibly pale and sweating through his dress shirt. He knew the federal tax liens were hanging over his head. He knew his contracting business was dead. But Patricia did not seem to notice his panic at all. She was radiating absolute unchecked arrogance. She believed she was walking into a surrender negotiation. She thought my silence during the previous day was a sign of total defeat. Vincent did not match her aggressive energy. He opened his leather binder and spoke in a soft, almost apologetic tone. He played the part of an overworked bureaucratic lawyer just trying to fill out mandatory paperwork. He asked her simple, mundane questions about her current address and her employment history. He allowed her to give long, rambling answers about her extensive volunteer work and her important social obligations. Patricia relaxed deeply into her leather chair. She crossed her legs and began to treat Vincent not as a hostile litigator, but as a captive audience. She assumed he was intimidated by her confidence and her projected wealth. Vincent slowly and methodically guided the conversation toward the core of their lawsuit. He asked her to describe the severe emotional and financial distress she claimed to be suffering. Patricia eagerly took the bait. She delivered a theatrical monologue about how my sudden cruelty had completely derailed her peaceful life. She claimed on the official record that she was spending sleepless nights agonizing over how to buy groceries for my starving daughter. She stated that she had been forced to rely on high-interest credit cards just to keep the heat running in her home because the financial burden was so immense. She painted a vivid picture of a mother sacrificing everything to save her child from a vindictive ex-husband. Vincent nodded sympathetically. He did not challenge a single lie. He just let the court reporter type every fabricated word into the permanent transcript. A skilled interrogator knows that you never interrupt an arrogant witness when they are building their own cage. You just nod and encourage them to keep adding bars to the windows. Then Vincent smoothly shifted the topic. He mentioned the original divorce settlement. He asked Patricia if she recalled the specific provisions we had made for Megan's higher education 15 years ago. Patricia waved her manicured hand dismissively. She stated that those old agreements were entirely irrelevant because circumstances had changed so drastically. Vincent flipped a page in his binder. He kept his eyes looking down at his notes. He asked her very casually about the custodial trust account I had established the week Megan was born. He noted for the record that Patricia was designated as the sole legal custodian of those funds. He asked if she had relied on that specific account to help alleviate the severe financial distress she was currently describing. He asked if she had used that money to pay the tuition bill. Patricia let out a short, condescending laugh. She looked at me with absolute contempt, and then looked back at Vincent. She stated that the trust account was completely useless. She claimed that the initial seed money I deposited had barely grown over the years. She told Vincent that the entire fund had been completely wiped out a long time ago. Vincent finally looked up from his notes. He asked her to clarify her statement for the official court record. He asked exactly how a protected custodial trust account managed to reach a balance of 0. Patricia did not hesitate for a single second. She sat up straighter and stated under oath that the money was lost in a severe market downturn. She claimed she had trusted a financial advisor who made terrible investments, and the entire portfolio collapsed. She swore that the remaining balance had been eaten up by standard banking fees over the last decade. She looked directly at the court reporter to ensure her fabricated tragedy was captured accurately. Vincent leaned forward, resting his hands on the glass table. He asked her one final, incredibly specific question. He asked if she had ever authorized a wire transfer moving funds from that custodial trust account directly into any corporate operating accounts owned by Stuart Collins. He asked if she had ever diverted that protected money to cover payroll or material expenses for her husband's contracting business. Stuart flinched so hard in his chair that the metal legs scraped loudly against the floor. He realized exactly what was happening, but he was legally forbidden from speaking. Patricia did not notice his terror. She scoffed loudly. She looked at Vincent as if he had just asked the most ridiculous question in the world. She stated firmly and unambiguously that she never touched a single dime of her daughter's money for personal or business use. She swore under penalty of perjury that the funds simply evaporated in the stock market. She dared Vincent to prove otherwise. A structural engineer knows that the moment the concrete sets, the foundation is permanent. You cannot unsign a document, and you cannot unswear an oath. Patricia had just cemented her own criminal conviction into the official legal transcript of a civil lawsuit. She had lied to a sworn officer of the court. She had committed blatant, undeniable perjury to cover up a massive financial embezzlement. She had just handed us the absolute right to demand criminal charges. Vincent did not pull out the wire transfer receipts. He did not slide the damning banking records across the table to prove she was lying. He did not want to show his hand before the trap was completely sealed. He simply smiled a very polite, professional smile. He thanked Patricia for her thorough and illuminating answers. He turned off the digital audio recorder and declared the deposition concluded. Patricia stood up, smoothing her designer skirt with a triumphant smirk on her face. She walked out of the conference room completely convinced she had just won $120,000. She thought she had outsmarted a highly paid corporate litigator. She had absolutely no idea she had just locked the door to her own prison cell. The mediation took place 2 weeks later in a neutral arbitration facility located deep in the financial district. It was a massive room built for high-stakes corporate warfare with thick soundproof walls and a long polished mahogany table. I arrived 30 minutes early with Vincent. I brought absolutely nothing with me except a single heavy manila folder. I placed it perfectly parallel to the edge of the table and folded my hands over it. We sat in the quiet room waiting for the opposition to arrive. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy frosted glass doors swung open. Patricia and Stuart did not just enter the conference room. They swaggered. They carried themselves with the absolute unwavering certainty of lottery winners walking up to the counter to claim their jackpot. Patricia wore a brand new tailored designer outfit, likely purchased on a high-interest credit card she fully assumed I was about to pay off. She carried a posture of total victory. Stuart walked right beside her with his chest puffed out, wearing a custom suit that struggled to hide his nervous sweating. He was playing the part of the triumphant patriarch, riding high on the belief that his financial rescue was only minutes away. Megan walked into the room right behind them. It was the first time I had seen my daughter in person since I canceled the bank transfers and blocked her number. I looked at her closely. She did not look like a struggling, terrified college student on the brink of academic ruin. She looked exactly like her mother. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and she was holding a premium iced coffee. Her posture was rigid and completely hostile. She did not offer me a greeting. She did not even acknowledge my presence as a human being. She simply glared at me from across the room. She was fully indoctrinated into their fabricated reality. She believed with absolute certainty that I was a vindictive deadbeat who had ruined her life over a simple piece of paper. She sat down heavily in the leather chair next to Stuart, leaning slightly toward him, as if seeking his protection from the evil man sitting across the table. She kept her arms crossed, waiting for me to fold. She was waiting for me to pull out a checkbook and apologize for the inconvenience. Mr. Walsh strutted into the room behind his clients, dropping his bulging briefcase onto the mahogany table with a loud theatrical thud. The neutral mediator was a retired judge with silver hair and a completely exhausted expression. He took his seat at the head of the table and calmly explained the rules of the session. He stated that the goal today was to find a mutually agreeable compromise to avoid a costly and protracted public trial. He asked Mr. Walsh to present their opening position. Mr. Walsh stood up, buttoned his tight suit jacket, and completely ignored the mediator. He spoke directly to me. He delivered a highly rehearsed emotional speech about the severe trauma I had inflicted upon an innocent young woman. He talked extensively about the sleepless nights Patricia endured trying to keep food on the table. He pointed a dramatic finger at Megan and declared that her bright academic career was hanging by a delicate thread entirely because of my selfish financial abandonment. Then Mr. Walsh played what he clearly thought was his absolute masterstroke. He stated that after reviewing my complete lack of remorse during the legal deposition, his clients had carefully reevaluated their position. He declared that the original demand of $120,000 was no longer sufficient to cover the mounting damages and emotional distress. He stated that if I wanted to walk out of this room today and prevent this humiliating case from going to a highly publicized trial, the price had officially gone up. Patricia and Stuart were now demanding a guaranteed tax-free settlement of exactly $150,000. Mr. Walsh smiled a wide, predatory smile. He stated that if I agreed to wire the funds by the end of the business day, they would graciously drop the lawsuit and sign a strict non-disclosure agreement to protect my professional reputation. They were offering to make the entire problem go away. They were essentially trying to sell me my own silence. Patricia leaned back in her chair and crossed her legs. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. She honestly thought she had completely cornered me. She thought I was a quiet, retired engineer who would panic at the mere threat of a public scandal. Stuart mirrored her confidence, nodding slowly, as if he had already mentally spent the money to pay off the federal tax liens currently threatening his home. He looked at Megan and patted her on the shoulder, performing his role as the caring provider perfectly. Megan kept her eyes locked on me, waiting for the inevitable surrender. She had spent her entire life watching me quietly pay the bills to keep the peace whenever her mother threw a tantrum. She had absolutely no reason to believe today would be any different. She expected me to lower my head and pay the ransom. The mediator turned his attention to our side of the table. He asked Vincent if we had a counteroffer to present to the plaintiffs. Vincent did not stand up. He did not raise his voice. He sat perfectly still and looked at the three people sitting across from us. He let the silence stretch out for a long, uncomfortable minute. In structural engineering, you can tell a great deal about the true integrity of a material by how it reacts to absolute silence. Solid concrete will hold steady, but cheap glass will begin to vibrate at the slightest shift in the air pressure. Stuart was vibrating. The arrogant smirk on his face began to falter as the silence dragged on. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her expensive leather chair. Megan looked back and forth between her mother and me, suddenly uncertain why the automated teller machine was not dispensing the requested cash. I rested my hands on the heavy manila folder sitting in front of me. The folder contained the exact coordinates of their total financial and criminal ruin. They had swaggered into the room, demanding $150,000 to make their fabricated problem disappear. They had absolutely no idea that they had just demanded ransom money from a man who was already holding all the detonators. I did not look at Patricia, and I did not look at Stewart. I looked directly at the young woman who had proudly traded my name for the name of a man who had robbed her blind. I was about to show her exactly how much that new name was truly worth. The retired judge sitting at the head of the table cleared his throat. He looked directly at Vincent and asked if the defense had a response to the settlement demand. The mediator expected a counteroffer. He expected Vincent to throw out a low number like $30,000 to start the traditional dance of negotiation. Patricia shifted in her seat, waiting for the haggling to begin. Stewart adjusted his silk tie, anticipating the cash injection that would save his business. Megan just glared at me, expecting me to open my checkbook and apologize for the inconvenience. Vincent did not reach for a pen. He did not open his briefcase to retrieve a settlement contract. He simply looked at Mr. Walsh with eyes as cold and gray as a winter storm. Vincent spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. He stated that we completely rejected the demand for $150,000. He stated that we also rejected the original demand for $120,000. He told the mediator that we were not offering a single penny to make this lawsuit go away. Mr. Walsh let out a loud, arrogant laugh. He slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table. He looked at the mediator and declared that we were acting in bad faith. He threatened to walk out of the room immediately and file the paperwork for a highly publicized civil trial. He promised to drag my name through the mud in front of a jury. Patricia smiled a vicious, triumphant smile. She thought my refusal to pay was just stubborn pride. She thought I was sealing my own financial doom. Vincent let Mr. Walsh finish his theatrical threat. Then Vincent reached across the table and picked up the heavy manila folder I had brought with me. He did not open it quickly. He pulled back the cover with the deliberate precision of a surgeon making the first incision. He extracted a thick stack of paper bound by a heavy black clip. He did not hand it to the mediator. He slid the packet directly across the polished wood. It stopped perfectly in front of Mr. Walsh. Vincent instructed the opposing counsel to turn to the third page. Mr. Walsh rolled his eyes, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. He picked up the packet with absolute disdain. He flipped to the third page, expecting to find a desperate legal technicality or a pathetic plea for sympathy. Instead, his eyes locked onto the official letterhead of the State Commercial Licensing Board. Vincent did not wait for Mr. Walsh to read the document in silence. Vincent began to read the numbers aloud for the entire room to hear. He recited the gross revenue of the contracting firm owned by Stewart for the previous 4 quarters. He then read the massive operating expenses. He read the outstanding commercial loan balances. He read the status of 6 different high-interest credit lines that were currently in default. Vincent stated for the official record that the business was not merely experiencing a temporary cash flow problem. The business was mathematically annihilated. It was running a catastrophic deficit. Stewart was completely and totally bankrupt. The atmosphere in this conference room shifted instantly. A structural engineer knows the exact sound a load-bearing beam makes right before it snaps. It is a sharp, terrifying crack that echoes through the entire building. That crack happened the moment Vincent read the final deficit number out loud. Patricia whipped her head around to look at her husband. Her vicious, triumphant smile completely vanished. It was replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Stewart was no longer puffing his chest out. He was physically shrinking into his expensive leather chair. The sweat on his forehead was now visible under the bright fluorescent lights of the arbitration facility. He could not look at his wife. He could not look at his stepdaughter. He stared down at the mahogany table as if he wished the wood would simply open up and swallow him whole. Megan uncrossed her arms. Her posture of rigid hostility faltered. She looked at the man she had proudly named herself after. She looked at the man who was supposed to be the wealthy, successful provider of her new family unit. She saw him trembling. She saw him looking like a terrified, cornered animal. Confusion began to cloud her features. She did not understand what was happening. She had been promised a quick victory. She had been told that I was the bad guy, withholding my massive wealth out of petty spite. She had no idea that her new father figure was completely destitute. Mr. Walsh stammered. He dropped the packet of papers onto the table as if the pages were physically burning his hands. He looked at the mediator and loudly objected. He shouted that the corporate financial records of the business were completely irrelevant to a lawsuit regarding college tuition and emotional distress. He demanded that the documents be stricken from the mediation record immediately. He claimed we were acting maliciously to embarrass his client. Vincent smiled. It was the sharp, predatory smile of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Vincent reminded Mr. Walsh of the official deposition transcript from the previous day. Vincent pointed out that Patricia had explicitly claimed severe financial distress under oath. She had sworn on the legal record that she was spending sleepless nights figuring out how to buy groceries. She had sworn she was relying on credit cards to keep the heat running in her home. Vincent stated that by building their entire lawsuit on the premise of financial ruin, they had legally opened the door to a complete forensic audit of their household income. Vincent declared that the business records were absolutely relevant. They proved exactly why Patricia and Stuart were experiencing financial distress. The distress was not caused by my sudden withdrawal of support. It was caused by years of gross corporate mismanagement and catastrophic debt. Vincent stated that they were attempting to use my checking account to bail out a sinking ship that was entirely of their own making. Mr. Walsh opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He realized he was trapped by his own aggressive strategy. He had spent the entire deposition proving that his clients had absolutely zero alternative funds. He had dug the hole himself. Vincent was not finished. He reached into the heavy manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was printed on official federal stationery. He slid the document across the table. It came to rest right on top of the corporate bankruptcy records. Vincent did not need to instruct Mr. Walsh to read it. The large, bold letters at the top of the page were impossible to miss. It was a federal tax lien. Vincent spoke with a voice that cut through the silence like a diamond blade cutting through glass. He informed the mediator and the opposing counsel that the Internal Revenue Service had placed a massive lien directly on the primary residence owned by Patricia and Stuart. He read the exact dollar amount aloud. They owed over $90,000 in back taxes, penalties, and compounding interest. He stated that the federal government was actively preparing to seize their home and forcibly liquidate their remaining assets. He noted that Stuart was likely facing federal criminal charges for severe tax evasion. The color completely and instantly drained from the face of Mr. Walsh. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge into empty space. The aggressive, theatrical bluster he had carried into the room evaporated in a single heartbeat. He looked at the federal document, and then he turned his head slowly to look at his own clients. Mr. Walsh was a contingency lawyer. He only got paid a percentage of the settlement if he successfully won the case. He had taken this lawsuit because Patricia and Stuart had convinced him that I was a wealthy, guilty ex-husband who would easily panic and write a massive check to avoid a public scandal. They had lied to him. They had hidden their total bankruptcy. They had hidden the federal tax lien. They had hidden the fact that any settlement money they managed to extort from me would instantly be seized by the Internal Revenue Service the moment it hit their bank accounts. Mr. Walsh realized he was working for absolutely free. He realized his clients were not struggling victims. They were desperate federal tax evaders trying to pull off a massive extortion scam using their college-aged daughter as a human shield. He saw the $90,000 tax debt staring back at him from the table. He knew his career could be severely compromised by participating in a fraudulent extortion attempt. Patricia tried to speak. She opened her mouth and reached a shaking hand toward her lawyer. She tried to say that it was all a misunderstanding. She tried to claim that her accountant had made a filing error and that they were resolving the issue privately. Her voice was thin and completely devoid of its usual arrogant command. Mr. Walsh did not even look at her. He raised his hand and sharply ordered his own client to remain completely silent. He told her not to say another word. His voice trembled with barely contained fury. He was furious at me for outsmarting him, but he was infinitely more furious at Patricia and Stewart for making him the fool. The retired judge, sitting at the head of the table, let out a long, heavy sigh. He looked at the federal tax lien and then looked at Stewart. The mediator had presided over hundreds of bitter family disputes, but the sheer audacity of this extortion attempt was staggering. He folded his hands together and stated that the complexion of this mediation had changed significantly. Megan was completely paralyzed in her chair. The iced coffee she had brought into the room was sweating, leaving a small puddle of water on the polished mahogany table. She looked at her mother. She looked at her new father. She saw the absolute panic in their eyes. The narrative she had been fed for 3 months was disintegrating right in front of her. She had been told that I was the villain holding back my vast wealth out of petty jealousy. She was now watching a corporate litigator mathematically prove that her mother and stepfather were completely broke, hiding from the federal government and facing the loss of their home. But the demolition was only halfway complete. Vincent had exposed the bankruptcy. He had exposed the federal tax evasion. He had exposed the core motive behind their frivolous $150,000 extortion demand. Patricia and Stewart were completely pinned to the wall. Their lawyer had abandoned them. The mediator was looking at them with undisguised contempt. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded over the manila folder. I watched the realization wash over the face of my daughter as the illusion of wealth shattered into 1,000 pieces. She was beginning to understand that the man she had named herself after could not even afford to keep a roof over his own head, let alone pay for her private university tuition. But she still did not know the most devastating truth of all. She still did not know how they planned to pay the government. Vincent turned his attention away from the panicked opposing counsel. He turned away from the furious mediator. He looked directly at Megan. He was preparing to deliver the final catastrophic blow. He was preparing to show her exactly how much her new last name had truly cost her. The room was spinning for everyone except me and Vincent. Mr. Walsh was staring at the ceiling, likely calculating how quickly he could legally withdraw as their counsel. Patricia was breathing in short, jagged gasps, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly, her knuckles were stark white. Stewart was completely broken, staring blankly at the polished wood, the reality of federal prison looming over him. But I was not looking at the lawyers or the mediator. I was not looking at my ex-wife or her ruined husband. I turned my head and focused my eyes entirely on Megan. Her iced coffee sat forgotten on the table. The defensive wall she had carried into the arbitration facility was completely shattered. She was looking at Stewart with an expression of profound confusion and growing horror. She had walked into this room believing she was fighting a righteous battle alongside a wealthy, successful father figure. She was now sitting next to a destitute, desperate man who was hiding from the federal government. But she still did not understand her own role in their desperate game. She still thought the lawsuit was about securing her college tuition. I reached into the heavy manila folder one last time. There was one final document remaining. I pulled out a thick packet of financial records bound by a silver clip. I did not slide this packet to Mr. Walsh. I did not offer it to the retired judge acting as the mediator. I placed my hand flat on the papers and pushed them across the smooth surface of the table directly toward my daughter. The packet slid to a stop right next to her trembling hands. Mr. Walsh instinctively reached out to intercept the documents. He was a lawyer, and allowing his client to receive unvetted evidence directly from the opposing party was a massive violation of protocol. Vincent did not even raise his voice. He simply told Mr. Walsh to leave the packet exactly where it was. He stated that the document was personal financial correspondence intended strictly for the plaintiff. Mr. Walsh pulled his hand back as if the paper were engulfed in flames. He had absolutely zero desire to associate himself with whatever explosive truth was hidden in those pages. I looked at Megan. I told her to open the packet. She hesitated. Her eyes darted from my face to her mother. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry, choking sound escaped her throat. Patricia knew exactly what was in that packet. She knew the absolute annihilation of her relationship with her daughter was sitting on the table. Megan slowly peeled back the cover page. She stared at the bank logo printed at the top of the first document. It was a regional credit union. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away all emotion, speaking with the cold, measured cadence of a structural engineer explaining a fatal flaw in a building's foundation. I told her that the week she was born, I walked into that specific credit union and opened a custodial trust account. I explained that I deposited a seed fund of $5,000 to start her college savings. I told her that for the next 15 years, through every promotion, through every economic downturn, and through the brutal financial strain of the divorce, I deposited money into that exact account every single month. I never missed a transfer. I explained the legal mechanics of the trust. Because Patricia was awarded primary custody during our divorce proceedings, the family court designated her as the sole legal custodian of those funds until Megan reached the age of 21. The money was legally ring-fenced. It was explicitly restricted by federal banking regulations to be used solely and exclusively for higher educational expenses. I instructed Megan to look at the balance line printed on the second page. I told her to look at the date. The statement was from exactly 2 years ago, right around the time she walked across the stage at her high school graduation. Megan traced her finger across the heavy black ink. Her voice was barely a whisper when she read the number out loud. $85,000. I nodded. I told her that $85,000 was more than enough liquid cash to cover the first 2 years of her tuition at the prestigious private university she had chosen. It was a solid, unbreakable foundation for her academic future. I told her that she never needed to worry about student loans or aggressive campus billing departments. Her education was fully funded. Then I told her to turn to the third page. The air in the room grew incredibly thin. Megan turned the page. She was looking at a sequential ledger of outbound wire transfers. I did not raise my voice, but every word I spoke fell like the strike of a heavy iron hammer. I told her to look at the dates. Over a period of exactly 3 weeks in August, 2 years prior, 4 massive wire transfers were authorized out of her custodial trust. The first was for $20,000. The second was for $30,000. The third was for $25,000. The final transfer drained the remaining $10,000. I told her to look at the ending balance on the bottom of the page. It was 0. Her entire future had been completely wiped out in 21 days. Megan looked up at me. The arrogant entitlement she had displayed earlier was entirely gone. Her eyes were wide and brimming with unshed tears. She asked me where the money went. I pointed at the document. I told her to look at the routing numbers attached to the outbound transfers. I explained that a wire transfer does not just disappear into the ether. It leaves a permanent, undeniable digital footprint. I told her that Vincent had traced those exact routing numbers through the federal banking system. I looked directly at Stuart. He was staring at the floor, his face completely pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. I told Megan that her college savings did not go to a mutual fund. They did not go to the university financial aid office. I stated with absolute surgical precision that every single dollar of her trust fund was wired directly into the corporate operating accounts of the contracting firm owned by Stuart Collins. I let the silence absorb the impact of that revelation. Megan slowly turned her head to look at the man sitting next to her, the man whose last name she had just legally adopted. I did not stop talking. I dismantled the rest of the illusion while she was staring at him. I explained exactly what happened 2 years ago. Stuart's business was rapidly collapsing under the weight of catastrophic debt and severe corporate mismanagement. The federal government was auditing his taxes. He needed a massive cash injection to keep the doors open and continue leasing his luxury vehicles. He needed a bailout, and Patricia handed him the keys to the vault. Patricia authorized the transfers. She liquidated her own daughter's protected trust account and handed $85,000 of stolen money to a failing contractor just to maintain the illusion of their wealthy suburban lifestyle. Megan gasped. It was a sharp, painful sound like all the oxygen had been punched out of her lungs. She looked at her mother. Patricia was weeping silently, her hands covering her face, unable to look her daughter in the eyes. I connected the final devastating pieces of the puzzle for her. I explained the scam. I told Megan that for 2 years, Patricia and Stuart prayed that Stuart's business would miraculously recover. They prayed he would secure a massive contract that would allow them to quietly replenish the trust fund before the university bills finally came due. But the business did not recover. It completely died. The IRS placed a lien on their house. And then her junior year tuition invoice arrived in the mail. They panicked. They had absolutely zero cash to pay the university, and they knew that if Megan went to the bank to access her trust fund, she would discover the theft. They needed to find $40,000 immediately, and they needed a scapegoat. I looked Megan directly in the eyes. I told her that they looked at me and saw the perfect target. I told her they orchestrated the entire name change process not out of love, but out of psychological manipulation. They pushed her to change her name, to isolate her, to make her feel profoundly loyal to Stuart, and to sever her emotional ties to me. They wanted her angry. They wanted her alienated from the only man who possessed the financial resources and the analytical capability to audit her accounts. Once she was completely isolated, they filed the frivolous lawsuit. I explained the sick, twisted genius of their extortion demand. They demanded $150,000 for emotional distress and living expenses. I told her that if I had caved to the pressure and written that settlement check, the money never would have reached her university billing portal. Patricia and Stuart would have taken the funds paid off the $90,000 federal tax lien to avoid prison and used the remainder to silently cover her tuition. They would have emerged, looking like the heroes who fought a bitter legal battle to save her academic career. They would have successfully used the legal system to force me to replenish the exact funds they had embezzled, and Megan would have spent the rest of her life believing I was a vindictive monster who abandoned her over a simple piece of paper. I stopped talking. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. The demolition was complete. The smoke was clearing, and the building was entirely gone. Megan dropped the packet of bank statements onto the mahogany table. Her hands were shaking violently. She looked at Stuart, who was weeping quietly into his hands. She looked at Patricia, who was desperately trying to reach out and touch her arm. Megan physically recoiled, sliding her chair back so forcefully it screeched against the carpet. She realized the profound, sickening truth. She had willingly discarded the name of the man who had quietly funded her entire existence and legally bound herself to a man who had robbed her blind to pay for his leased luxury cars. She had been nothing more than a human shield in a federal extortion scheme. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of a daughter realizing her entire family was a lie. The silence in the room finally shattered. It did not break with a quiet apology or a tearful confession. It shattered with the ugly, desperate sound of self-preservation. Patricia lunged out of her chair, pushing herself away from the mahogany table as if the wood itself were toxic. She turned her entire body toward Stuart and unleashed a torrent of hysterical blame. She screamed that it was all his fault. She wept violently, claiming she was manipulated by his constant begging and his hollow promises that the contracting business would miraculously recover. She yelled for the entire room to hear that he had forced her to authorize those massive wire transfers to save his miserable, failing company from total ruin. Stuart did not sit and take the abuse. The terrified, cornered animal inside him finally snapped. He leaped to his feet, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. It crashed against the soundproof wall with a violent thud. He began screaming at the top of his lungs. He did not yell at me or at Vincent. He screamed directly at Mr. Walsh and the retired judge acting as the mediator. He shouted that this arbitration was a deliberate setup. He roared that his corporate financial records were illegally obtained and that we were maliciously framing him for a simple accounting error. His face was a mask of purple rage with spit flying from his lips, as he desperately tried to project dominance in a room where he had absolutely zero power. He blamed the lawyers for trapping him in a blind ambush, and he blamed Patricia for being careless with the paper trail. They were viciously tearing each other apart right in front of us. I ignored their chaotic screaming match entirely. My eyes remained fixed strictly on Megan. She was completely frozen in the center of the hurricane. The frantic screams of her mother and her new father faded into the background. She was staring down at the thick packet of bank statements resting on the table. Her hands gripped the edges of the paper so tightly her knuckles were visibly trembling. The pristine illusion of her life was completely eradicated. She was staring at the undeniable mathematical proof of her own betrayal. I watched the devastating realization wash over her pale face. She slowly turned her head and looked at the man she had proudly named herself after. She saw him screaming and sweating, a pathetic, desperate fraud who had robbed his own stepdaughter to cover his gross incompetence. Then she looked across the long table directly at me. She looked at the man she had legally abandoned and treated like a discarded automated teller machine. She finally understood that while she was busy erasing my name from her identity, I had been the only person quietly building the secure foundation for her entire future. She had thrown away the man who freely paid for everything to worship the man who silently stole it all. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid as the crushing weight of her terrible decision settled permanently onto her shoulders. The mediator did not wait for the allotted time to expire. He declared the session terminated and advised the opposing counsel to deeply reconsider his position. Mr. Walsh packed his briefcase with frantic, jagged movements and practically ran out of the soundproof doors, leaving his own clients sitting at the table. Vincent collected the single heavy manila folder. He told Patricia and Stewart that the countersuit was already filed with the county court. He gave them exactly 72 hours to decide how they wanted to proceed before he formally referred the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. The collapse of their legal extortion attempt happened with breathtaking speed. By Wednesday afternoon, Mr. Walsh had officially filed a motion to withdraw as their legal counsel, citing irreconcilable differences and a total breakdown of the attorney-client relationship. By Thursday morning, the frivolous $150,000 lawsuit filed against me was formally dropped with prejudice. They could never file it again. They were completely disarmed. But my countersuit remained entirely active and aimed directly at their absolute financial ruin. Vincent did not give them an inch of breathing room. He presented them with a brutal, unyielding ultimatum. Patricia and Stewart had exactly two options. Option A was a grueling public civil trial combined with a referral for criminal embezzlement charges. Vincent promised that the federal tax liens and the stolen trust fund would be exposed on the public record, and that Patricia would likely face severe prison time for the catastrophic breach of her fiduciary duties regarding her own daughter's money. Option B was absolute unconditional surrender. Vincent drafted a binding settlement agreement. The terms were draconian. Patricia and Stewart were required to immediately liquidate any remaining equity they possessed in their primary residence and transfer those funds directly into a new secure trust account, exclusively controlled by a neutral third-party financial administrator for Megan. They were legally barred from ever contacting me for financial assistance again. They were forced to cover every single dollar of Vincent's exorbitant legal fees. If they failed to meet any of the conditions, the criminal referral would be executed instantly. They chose option B. They signed the agreement on Friday afternoon in the presence of a notary. They did not try to negotiate or ask for a payment plan. They were too terrified of the federal government and the looming threat of prison. By signing the agreement, they officially signed away the last remaining shreds of their fabricated suburban wealth. The house with the manicured lawn and the heated pool would be sold to satisfy the IRS and replenish the stolen college fund. Stewart was forced to formally file for Chapter 7 corporate bankruptcy, wiping out his contracting business entirely. He would never hold a commercial builder's license in the state again. The stage they had spent 15 years building collapsed into a pile of worthless rubble. The illusion of the successful, wealthy stepfather and the devoted, sacrificing mother was completely eradicated. They were exposed as desperate, frightened thieves who had attempted to use their own child as a human shield in a federal extortion scheme. The quiet, retired structural engineer they thought they could easily manipulate had completely dismantled their entire reality. I did not feel a sense of triumphant joy when Vincent confirmed the agreement was executed. I felt the deep, profound satisfaction of restoring the natural order. The structure was finally cleared. The lot was empty. Now the hardest part of the demolition remained. The aftermath. The final piece of the demolition did not happen in a sterile courtroom or a downtown mediation facility. It happened on my front porch exactly 2 weeks after the settlement was signed. It was a cold Tuesday afternoon. The winter wind was stripping the last dead leaves from the oak trees lining the street. I was sitting in my study reviewing architectural blueprints for my custom gazebo when the perimeter alert chimed on my security tablet. I did not see a luxury sport utility vehicle parked in the driveway. I saw a cheap, compact rideshare car idling by the curb. The security feed showed a single figure walking slowly up the concrete path. It was Megan. I walked to the foyer and opened the heavy steel-reinforced door. She stood on the welcome mat, shivering in the cold winter air. She looked entirely different from the arrogant, hostile young woman who had glared at me across the mahogany arbitration table. She looked small, exhausted, and completely defeated. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She did not have Patricia standing behind her to whisper manipulative lies. She did not have Stuart there to project a false sense of wealthy security. She was entirely alone, facing the man she had legally discarded. She began to cry the moment the door swung open. She did not yell or demand anything. She launched into a desperate, messy apology that spilled out of her in a rush of tears and broken sentences. She told me she had moved out of her mother's house and was sleeping on a friend's couch. She told me the entire environment had turned completely toxic the second the settlement was signed. She sobbed heavily, saying she had absolutely no idea that Stuart and Patricia had stolen her college fund. She swore she was manipulated into the legal name change because Patricia convinced her it was the only way to build a real, permanent family. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. She asked if I could ever forgive her for being so stupid and so blind. Then she asked the question that revealed she still did not fully understand the permanence of a collapsed structure. She asked if I could just log into the university portal and pay her tuition balance directly so she could register for the spring semester. She wanted to know if we could just go back to the way things used to be before the lawsuit and the name change. I stood in the doorway. I did not step forward to embrace her. I did not invite her out of the cold and into my living room to cry on my shoulder. A structural engineer knows that you cannot rebuild a demolished building by simply pouring fresh paint over shattered concrete. The old foundation was permanently gone. I looked at the young woman standing on my porch, and I felt a profound sense of analytical clarity. I kept my voice perfectly level and devoid of any harsh anger. I told her that I believed her. I validated the pain she was experiencing. I told her that I knew Patricia and Stuart were master manipulators who had used her desire for a perfect family as a weapon. I acknowledged that being used as a human shield in a federal extortion scheme by the people who were supposed to protect you is a deeply traumatic experience. But then I drew the absolute unyielding boundary. I told her that while she was manipulated, she was also a legal adult. I reminded her that nobody forced her to write that entitled email accusing me of ruining her life over a simple piece of paper. Nobody forced her to sit in a mediation room and glare at me while her mother demanded $150,000. I told her that in the adult world, every single choice carries massive structural consequences. I told her we could not go back to the way things were because the man who blindly paid for everything no longer existed. I explained that the automated teller machine was permanently destroyed. I told her that Vincent had finalized the trust administration that morning. The equity stripped from Patricia's home was securely locked in a new educational trust managed by a neutral third-party firm. I told Megan that the administrator would pay her tuition directly to the university and disperse a strict, modest allowance for basic housing. I looked directly into her eyes and told her she was going to have to get a part-time job to cover the rest of her luxury expenses. I told her she was going to learn how to budget, how to pay her own utility bills, and how to stand on her own 2 feet. I told her that true independence is not found by legally changing your last name to flatter a thief. True independence is built by carrying your own weight. Megan stopped crying. She stared at me, realizing that the safety net was officially gone and the new reality was permanent. She did not argue or scream. She simply nodded slowly, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. She turned around and walked back down the driveway toward the waiting car. I watched her leave, knowing it was the hardest but most necessary lesson she would ever learn. I closed the heavy oak door and locked the deadbolt, leaving the cold winter wind outside. The winter finally broke, giving way to the early days of spring. I sat on my back porch in the quiet hours of the morning, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The air was still crisp, but the bitter freezing winds had finally passed. I looked out over the lawn where the frost was slowly melting into the grass. My cell phone rested on the small wooden table next to my chair. The screen was completely blank. It did not vibrate with frantic demands. It did not light up with entitled accusations or manipulative pleas. It was just a piece of plastic and glass, completely silent and entirely under my control. For 15 years, I had allowed myself to be held hostage by the illusion of a perfect family. I had paid an astronomical price to maintain a structure that was fundamentally hollow. I had let Patricia dictate my worth. I had allowed Stuart to play the role of the beloved patriarch, using my money to fund his arrogance. I had watched Megan eagerly adopt a new name, believing she was stepping into a better life while leaving me behind as nothing more than a discarded utility. I had absorbed all the stress and carried all the weight because I thought that was what a good father was supposed to do. I thought that if I just reinforced the foundation with enough money, the building would eventually stabilize. But a structural engineer knows that you cannot save a building built on a swamp. The ground will always swallow your efforts. You have to be willing to tear it down and start over. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The bitter taste grounded me in the present moment. I had lost my daughter. That was an undeniable reality. I would not walk her down the aisle, and I would not be invited to her graduation. But the pain of that loss was no longer a crushing weight. It had transformed into a quiet, dull ache of acceptance. Megan was an adult now. She was living in a modest apartment, working a part-time job to cover the grocery and utility expenses that her recovered trust fund did not allow. She was learning the difficult, heavy lessons of the real world. Perhaps one day, years from now, she would understand the profound value of the harsh boundary I had drawn. But even if she never understood, I was entirely at peace with my decision. I had forced her to grow up. My finances were completely secure. The massive drain on my retirement accounts had been permanently sealed. I did not have to worry about funding another one of Stuart's failed ventures. I did not have to worry about funding Patricia's luxury vacations disguised as family emergencies. The extortion attempt had failed spectacularly, blowing back on them with the force of a hurricane. Patricia and Stuart were currently navigating the brutal reality of federal tax debt and absolute social ruin. They had lost their house and their reputation. They had gambled their entire existence on my submission, and they had lost everything. I looked at the empty space in my backyard, where I planned to build my custom wooden gazebo. I had already drawn up the blueprints. I had calculated the load-bearing requirements and selected the premium cedar lumber. I was going to build it entirely with my own 2 hands. I was going to construct something beautiful and strong, something that belonged solely to me. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the birds waking up in the trees. The demolition was officially over. The toxic debris had been cleared away. The ground was finally level and perfectly stable. I was 66 years old, and I had never felt more powerful. I had faced the ultimate betrayal, and I had not simply survived it. I had engineered my own rescue. I had reclaimed my absolute dignity and restored the natural order of my life. The storm had passed, and the foundation was solid. The ultimate lesson of Lawrence's journey is that true respect and independence cannot be bought, nor can they be demanded through entitlement. For decades, Lawrence believed that silently absorbing financial and emotional burdens was the definition of being a good father. However, enabling toxic behavior only weakens the foundation of a family. By finally drawing an unyielding boundary and refusing to be manipulated, he didn't just protect his own peace and dignity. He forced those who took him for granted to face the brutal, inescapable reality of their own choices. Sometimes the most necessary thing you can do is let a rotten structure collapse so that something genuine can eventually be built from the rubble. If you have ever had to draw a hard boundary to protect your own peace and dignity from toxic family members, share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering stories of reclaiming your life.